The party at Donovan's bar represents the emotional and narrative climax where Connor transforms from a betrayed, passive victim into an active agent of truth, and this moment encapsulates the entire story's power. When Troy lunged at him in desperation, Connor sidestepped with the practiced ease of a man who'd been in real fights, catching him with an uppercut that sent him crashing into a table. And Jaime stood up with his face flushed red with anger, staring at his mother with pure disgust as he asked if the cheating was really true. And Stephanie's carefully constructed world collapsed in real time as her son turned away from her, and everyone in that room finally saw her for what she was. Not a devoted wife, but a calculating manipulator who'd been exposed. This paragraph is the hook because it combines physical action, emotional revelation, family betrayal, and the moment where truth becomes undeniable and public, forcing Stephanie to face the consequences of her lies with no escape route, no performance, no manipulation left to deploy.
Connor Dempsey had spent 15 years building a life with Stephanie, a woman whose blonde hair and green eyes had once looked at him with admiration that felt like devotion. But insomnia gave him the unwanted gift of noticing what he'd been too trusting to see before. At 3 a.m, sitting in his Medford, Massachusetts kitchen with lukewarm coffee growing cold between his hands, he realized that the woman he'd married had become a phantom, wearing his silk nightgown Christmas present while wearing her lies even more comfortably. And the receipts, crumpled in her purse, told a story that his heart refused to accept, but his mind could no longer ignore. The lingerie was size small when Stephanie wore medium, and the hotel reservation bore the names S. Dempsey and T. Melman. And Troy Melman was the boss with perfect teeth in the BMW who had been coming to their barbecues for 2 years, shaking his hand and complimenting his burgers while apparently planning to take everything Connor had built. Connor had been an ex-cop turned carpenter, a man trained to notice details and follow evidence, yet he had missed the most obvious signs right under his own roof. The phone placed face down on the nightstand, the 40-minute showers after supposedly 6 o'clock meetings that kept his wife out until 10:30 at night, the way her green eyes now looked through him like he was furniture in a house she'd stopped inhabiting emotionally. When Stephanie appeared in the kitchen doorway at 3:17, asking with practiced concern that sounded more like annoyance if he couldn't sleep again, Connor knew he had entered a new chapter of his life, one where he would have to become someone harder, sharper, and more willing to fight than the trusting man who had said "I do" all those years ago. The discovery of her betrayal was not a single revelation, but rather a cascade of small horrors that added up to a complete portrait of infidelity. The hidden phone appearing in her purse, the texts to Troy saying she couldn't wait to feel him again and that Connor was too stupid and trusting, the references to a lawyer and full custody of Jamie, their 16-year-old son who still looked at his father like he was a hero. That night, after Stephanie returned to bed, Connor called his brother Paul, the only person he trusted completely, and for the first time since he'd discovered the receipts, he spoke the words aloud into the darkness. "Stephanie's cheating on me." And from that moment forward, the man Connor Dempsey had been began to die, replaced by someone determined to expose the truth and protect his son from the woman who had become a stranger wearing the face of his wife. When Paul retrieved the cassette tape labeled Connor Truth from the attic, Connor felt the weight of generational curses pressing down upon his shoulders, for his mother's voice emerged from that ancient machine with the weary resignation of a woman who had lived through her own marriage's destruction and was desperately trying to spare her son from the same fate she had endured. The first tape revealed that his mother had been unfaithful herself, confessing through the speaker that she had lied to his father, manipulated him, hidden her phone, stayed out late, bought lingerie for other men, and gaslighted him when he became suspicious, making him question his own perceptions of reality, just as Stephanie was now doing to Connor with her practiced concern and her face-down phone on the nightstand. But the second tape, labeled Stephanie Warning, was the real bombshell, because Connor's mother had documented her observations of Stephanie's behavior years before the marriage, noting how she manipulated Connor during his engagement, isolated him from his friends, and made him feel like he wasn't good enough for her.
the exact same psychological tactics that Connor had been experiencing over the past 15 years without fully understanding how he'd been systematically diminished. Paul opened an envelope containing photographs of Stephanie entering hotels with a man named David Morrison 2 years earlier, kissing him in parking lots, buying lingerie at downtown stores, proof that Troy Melman wasn't her first affair, just her most recent one, and that she had been planning her escape for years by hiding money in a secret bank account under her maiden name with almost $50,000 in it that should have gone to Jamie's college fund and their family's future. The revelation that his mother had followed Stephanie, taken pictures, documented lies, and left detailed notes about her manipulations felt like reaching through time to receive a final gift from a woman who had died trying to protect the family she left behind. And Connor suddenly understood that this wasn't just about exposing Stephanie's infidelity. It was about breaking a cycle, about refusing to be the broken man his father had become, slowly destroyed by a wife who viewed him as nothing more than a stepping stone to something better. Connor listened to his mother's tired voice on that tape, describing how she'd heard Stephanie tell her sister that she'd married beneath herself, that Connor was useful for stability while she built her career, but that she'd always planned to trade up eventually, calling him a dumb cop turned carpenter, a useful tool rather than a partner. And he felt rage crystallize into purpose, because now he had proof that his mother's worst fears about Stephanie had been correct, that the signs his mother had meticulously documented were now manifesting exactly as she'd warned they would, and that he had the evidence necessary to not just survive this battle with Stephanie, but to emerge victorious, protected by the love of a mother who had understood human nature's capacity for deception well enough to create a roadmap for her son's redemption. The plan Connor and his lawyer Maura constructed was elegant in its simplicity. A surprise anniversary party at Donovan's bar, where Stephanie thought she was being celebrated for 15 years of marriage, but instead would have her carefully constructed lies displayed on a large screen television in front of witnesses who mattered: Troy's wife Karen, Stephanie's best friend Ashley, Connor's old police colleagues, neighbors, and most importantly, their 16-year-old son Jaime, who deserved to know the truth about the woman he'd trusted to love his father faithfully. Connor spent the week before the party setting up hidden cameras around the house with Paul's help and preparing a digital presentation that would make Stephanie's betrayal impossible to deny or explain away, meticulously selecting every screenshot, every receipt, every lie that would be blown up large enough for a crowded room to read and process and understand. Saturday evening arrived gray and drizzly, appropriately matching the mood of what Connor was about to orchestrate, and Stephanie spent 2 hours getting ready, transforming herself into the perfect picture of a devoted wife, while practicing her surprised expression in the mirror, completely unaware that her performance was about to be interrupted by the most humiliating moment of her life. When Connor stood up to give his toast about marriage being built on trust, honesty, commitment, and faithfulness, he watched Stephanie beam at him, thinking he was about to propose renewing their vows, and he felt a cold clarity wash over him as he signaled to Mickey, the bartender, to dim the lights and turn on the projection screen that would reveal the truth. The first images showed their wedding day, the house, Jaime as a baby, family vacations, the normal markers of a successful marriage. But then the screen filled with the hotel receipt for S. Dempsey and T. Melman, followed by the text messages from Stephanie's burner phone blown up large enough for everyone to read, and the room went dead silent as the guests finally understood what this party was really about. Connor's voice cut through the silence with surgical precision as he addressed Troy directly, laying out the facts of his infidelity with the methodical detail of a prosecutor presenting a homicide case, and then turned to Stephanie, forcing her to hear herself described as she actually was, a woman who had been planning to divorce him and take their son away, who had called him too stupid to figure out what she was doing, who had been willing to lie to the police and destroy his reputation to secure custody and assets. When Troy lunged at him in desperation, Connor sidestepped with the practiced ease of a man who'd been in real fights, catching him with an uppercut that sent him crashing into a table, and Jaime stood up with his face flush red with anger, staring at his mother with pure disgust as he asked if the cheating was really true, and Stephanie's carefully constructed world collapsed in real time as her son turned away from her and everyone in that room finally saw her for what she was, not a devoted wife, but a calculating manipulator who'd been exposed. The war shifted from personal betrayal to institutional warfare when Stephanie's lawyers filed for emergency custody, claiming Connor had anger management issues and a drinking problem, attempting to manufacture doubt in the family court system before he could present his evidence of her infidelity. And Connor watched helplessly as news vans parked outside his house while reporters set up cameras to broadcast stories about a local man accused of domestic violence in a bitter custody battle, with quotes from Ashley, Stephanie's Instagram influencer friend, claiming Connor had always had a temper and that Stephanie was terrified of what he might do. The police arrived with young officers asking about alleged domestic disturbances, but when Connor showed them the recordings of Stephanie's conversations, the text messages from her burner phone, and the photographs Paul had found in their mother's belongings, both officers looked uncomfortable and admitted this was a civil matter they couldn't touch, leaving without filing charges, but not before warning him to keep things civil, while Connor felt the unfairness of a system that allowed false allegations to damage his reputation before any court could evaluate the actual evidence. Maura called with a strategic counteroffensive. She would file for emergency custody of Jaime based on parental alienation and moral unfitness, freeze all marital assets, including the secret bank account Stephanie didn't know they'd discovered, and use the media campaign against Connor as evidence of her conspiracy to destroy his reputation through coordinated lies and harassment that went far beyond the bounds of normal divorce proceedings. At 2 p.m., news vans from Channel 7, Channel 5, and Channel 4 all arrived, feeding off the story that someone had leaked to the media, and Connor watched himself on the 6 o'clock news being portrayed as a toxic husband, while Ashley looked concerned on camera and made sure her good side was visible. A coordinated attack designed to prejudge him in the court of public opinion before the actual custody hearing could take place. Jaime came home from school to find reporters camped on the front lawn, and Connor had to explain that his mother was trying to destroy his reputation before the custody hearing, that cornered animals did desperate things, and that they needed to trust the legal process and the evidence they had on their side, even as every news cycle seemed designed to reinforce Stephanie's narrative that he was a controlling, possessive man with anger issues who couldn't be trusted with his own son. The emergency hearing arrived at 10 a.m., and Connor put on his best suit and drove to the courthouse with Jaime, stopping to tell the assembled reporters that he had evidence of Stephanie's cheating, her hidden bank accounts, and her plan to frame him for domestic abuse, declaring to the cameras that all of this evidence would be presented in court before walking inside, where Maura methodically laid out the case like a prosecutor presenting a homicide. The hotel receipts, the burner phone messages, the photographs from 2 years earlier, the secret bank account, and most devastatingly, the threatening email Troy had sent from a fake account promising to destroy Connor completely. The judge studied the evidence, then looked at Jaime and asked if he was old enough to have an opinion about where he wanted to live, and when Jaime stood up and said he wanted to live with his father because his mother had lied and planned to lie, the judge granted temporary custody to Connor, froze all marital assets, and issued a restraining order preventing Stephanie and Troy from contacting him except through attorneys.
The attack came at 4:30 in the morning, 3 days after the custody hearing, when Connor woke up to the sound of breaking glass and the smell of gasoline as someone threw a Molotov cocktail through their living room window, and he grabbed the fire extinguisher from the hallway and extinguished the flames before they could spread through the house that was finally completely theirs. The message spray-painted on what remained of their front window read, "Wife beater," a desperate attempt to revive the false narrative that had already been destroyed in court, but now it was accompanied by actual criminal violence, by an actual attempt to burn down his family's home. And the police found the remains of the Molotov cocktail in the front yard, while Paul arrived carrying a shotgun and scanning the street for threats like he was still in the Middle East. The security cameras Paul had installed captured a silver BMW driving slowly past their house at 4:15 a.m., and the partial license plate matched Troy Melman's vehicle registration, and within hours, Troy was under arrest for arson and attempted homicide, the police finding gasoline in his trunk along with 3 more beer bottles, rags, and a notebook detailing his plan to frame Connor for domestic violence, with staged photographs and forged medical records that Stephanie had documented in meticulous detail.
An emergency hearing was called in Judge Morrison's chambers, and when asked where he was at 4:30 in the morning, Troy's claim of being asleep at home fell apart when Stephanie admitted she was with him at his apartment, and Maura presented the security footage showing the silver BMW driving past their house at exactly the right time, turning what had been a legal battle into a criminal one, with attempted homicide charges that suddenly made everything else, the affairs, the lies, the manipulation, seem almost quaint by comparison. The police found not just gasoline and materials for more Molotov cocktails in Troy's car, but also a notebook documenting a detailed plan to stage photographs of Connor hitting Stephanie, to forge medical records showing injuries he'd never inflicted, to manufacture evidence of the domestic violence that had never happened. And Stephanie's involvement was documented on nearly every page, making her not just an adulteress and manipulator, but an active conspirator in a plot to burn down her family's home. Judge Morrison's expression hardened as she processed what she was reading, as she understood that this wasn't just a bitter divorce or even a custody dispute. This was an attempt to commit murder, to destroy a family, to eliminate witnesses to their crimes. And when she reconvened the hearing that afternoon, she looked at Stephanie with barely concealed contempt and informed her that she was facing criminal charges in addition to losing everything in the divorce, recommending that the district attorney pursue charges for conspiracy, attempted arson, and attempted homicide that could put both her and Troy away for 10 years or more.
The judge's final ruling arrived like a thunderclap after a long storm, delivering to Connor everything he'd fought for and more. Full custody of Jaime effective immediately, the marital home and all assets except Stephanie's personal belongings, recognition that she had conspired to commit perjury and fraud and essentially kidnapping by attempting to gain custody through false accusations, and a formal recommendation to the district attorney to pursue criminal charges that would remove both Stephanie and Troy from society for years to come. As Connor left the courthouse, Jaime was waiting on the steps with a look of relief that suggested the weight of uncertainty had finally lifted. And when Connor asked if it was over, he could tell his son wanted to believe it was, wanted to trust that his mother's lies and his father's perseverance had finally reached some kind of resolution where the truth had prevailed and justice had been served according to the law. The house still smelled like smoke from the firebombing, but Connor claimed it completely now, truly owned it in every sense. And that night, Paul came over with Chinese takeout and beer, and they sat in the kitchen avoiding the living room where the carpet was still scorched. And when Paul asked what came next, Connor said they would rebuild. New carpet, new windows, new life. Understanding that rebuilding wasn't just about the physical damage, but about recovering his sense of self that Stephanie had spent 15 years diminishing. 3 weeks later, when the divorce papers arrived and Connor read through the final decree, the marriage was officially dissolved and everything he'd fought for was legally his. The house, custody of Jaime, most of their assets, while Stephanie faced a criminal record and a reputation that would follow her for the rest of her life. And there was a letter from Stephanie written from jail admitting that she'd destroyed everything good in her life because she was selfish and stupid and thought she deserved better than what she had, that she was wrong about everything, but especially about him being too stupid or too trusting, and that he had been just a better person than she was. Connor read the letter twice, then threw it away, understanding that Stephanie's remorse meant nothing compared to the damage she'd tried to inflict, that her confession in jail couldn't undo the fire or the lies or the years of psychological manipulation. And he focused instead on Jaime, on grilling burgers in the backyard, and talking about his son's college plans to study engineering and maybe become a builder like their grandfather. Proud that Jaime had stood by him when it would have been easier to believe his mother's narrative. Grateful that his son understood that families shouldn't require performances and pretense and walking on eggshells around someone who was lying every single day. The days immediately following the final judgment felt strange and disorienting in a way Connor hadn't anticipated, because having spent months in constant battle, gathering evidence, preparing legal arguments, appearing in court, and dealing with the emotional whiplash of his wife's escalating attacks, he suddenly found himself in a world where the threat had been neutralized, and his job was simply to exist as a father and a man in a house that was finally his, without condition or caveat. Maura called with a text message that read, "Congratulations on your freedom. You deserve better," refusing to let him pay her full fee and claiming that destroying Stephanie and Troy had been payment enough. And Connor understood that there were people in the world who believed in justice enough to fight for it without requiring financial compensation, who understood that some battles were worth fighting for reasons beyond profit or advancement. He looked around his backyard at the deck he'd built with his own hands, at the garden he and Jaime had planted together, at the house that had once felt like a stage where they performed the roles of a happy family, but now felt like an actual home where people could breathe and be honest without fear of manipulation or betrayal. And he thought about how Stephanie had been right about one thing. He did deserve better. He deserved honesty and loyalty and a family that didn't lie to him or plot against him or try to burn down everything he'd worked for. Jaime finished his burger and asked if Connor was proud of him for standing by his father when it would have been easier to believe his mother's lies. And Connor told his son that he was incredibly proud, that Jaime had shown more integrity and courage at 16 than many adults displayed their entire lives, and that their relationship had been forged through fire in a way that would make it unbreakable. The house that had once been filled with the tension of unspoken lies and hidden phones and practiced expressions of concern was now filled with genuine laughter and honest conversations, with the sound of Jaime talking on the phone to his girlfriend Emma about college in the future. And Connor realized that the greatest victory wasn't legal or financial, but emotional and spiritual. He had his son back, fully and completely, without the interference of a woman who had seen them both as obstacles to her own happiness rather than as human beings worthy of love and loyalty. When Connor scrolled through his contacts looking for Paul's number to thank him for everything, his brother answered before it even rang twice, asking how Connor was holding up, and Connor said he was doing well, really well. Grateful for the cameras and the evidence from their mother's attic, and for having a brother who stood by him when things got dangerous and terrifying. Paul reminded him that Stephanie had been poisoned, that she had slowly been ending everything good about Connor. And looking back, Connor could see clearly how he'd changed during the marriage, how he'd become smaller and more cautious and less confident, how he'd started believing Stephanie's subtle criticisms that he wasn't quite good enough for her. But now he understood the simple truth. He had been good enough. He was more than good enough. He was a good father and a good provider and a loyal husband who had trusted the wrong person. And the shame of that didn't belong to him, but to the woman who had betrayed that trust. The man who stood on his back porch 6 months after the final judgment was fundamentally different from the man who had sat in his kitchen at 3 a.m, drinking lukewarm coffee and staring at receipts for lingerie his wife didn't fit into. Because that man had been slowly dying, diminished by someone who made him question his own worth, while this man had reclaimed himself through battle and truth and the refusal to accept the narrative that he was somehow less than, that his wife's betrayal reflected some inadequacy in him rather than reflecting her own moral emptiness. Connor had started dating again, carefully and slowly, but with the confidence of a man who knew his own value and could recognize a genuine person when he met one, no longer fooled by beauty or charm or practiced expressions of concern, but instead looking for honesty and integrity, and someone who could look at him with eyes that actually saw him rather than looked through him like he was furniture in someone else's story. Jaime was preparing for college applications, having decided to study engineering and follow in his grandfather's footsteps toward building and creating things that would last. And he told his father that the best part of all this was that they didn't have to pretend anymore, didn't have to act like everything was fine when it wasn't, didn't have to walk on eggshells around someone who was lying to them every single day. And Connor understood that his son had articulated the deepest victory, freedom from the burden of maintaining false appearances, from the exhausting work of accepting crumbs of affection from someone who is incapable of genuine love. The carpentry business that had been neglected during the months of legal battles began to thrive again as Connor poured himself into his work with renewed focus and energy, accepting projects he loved and turning down jobs that didn't align with his values, living with intention rather than just surviving from day to day.
And he discovered that creativity and honest work were powerful healers, that building things with his own hands reminded him of his own competence and worth in ways that no therapist's validation could match. When Troy was convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison for arson and attempted homicide, and Stephanie received a 6-year sentence for conspiracy and fraud, Connor felt something that surprised him. Not satisfaction or vindication, but something closer to pity for two people who had destroyed themselves through their own choices, who had thrown away everything good in their lives because they couldn't accept what they had or appreciate what they'd been given. The letter Stephanie had written from jail sat at the bottom of a drawer, her confession that Connor was a better person than she was, her admission that she'd been wrong about everything. But Connor rarely thought about it anymore because he'd learned that some people apologize only when they're facing consequences, only when their manipulations have failed and they're looking at years in a cell. And real redemption requires sustained change over time, not letters written in desperation. On quiet evenings, Connor would sit on the deck he'd built and watch the sunset over his neighborhood, and he would think about his mother, about the tapes she'd left behind, about the way she'd tried to protect her son even from beyond the grave, and he would feel grateful for the women in his life who had loved him truly. His mother, who saw through Stephanie's lies, his lawyer, Maura, who fought for justice without needing financial reward, and his son, Jaime, who stood by him when it would have been easier to stay with his mother's narrative. Connor Dempsey, the carpenter, the ex-cop, the man his father might have become if he'd had the courage to fight, had finally reclaimed himself completely. And as he looked toward a future filled with honest relationships, meaningful work, and a son who had become his greatest pride, he understood that the greatest victory wasn't what he'd won in court, but what he'd reclaimed within himself. His sense of worth, his ability to recognize truth from lies, and the knowledge that he deserved nothing less than loyalty, honesty, and genuine love from the people in his life.